Deep in rural West Texas, nestled among dying trees and dry, cracked earth, stood an old, sagging house. It wasn't particularly special, just one of those forgotten places scattered across the country, with peeling paint, a rotting porch, and a lone oak tree whose roots had begun to crawl under the foundation. But this house had something different. A little girl lived there. Her name was Elizabeth, and she had been dead for over 50 years. Brian Johnson bought the house for next to nothing. He was in his 60s, his wife had passed away a few years prior, and he was looking for a quiet place to spend the rest of his days. The real estate agent hesitated before selling it to him, but Brian didn't pay much attention to that. He didn't believe in ghosts. The first night was peaceful, but on the second night, he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been his imagination, like a child's laughter. He woke up suddenly, sitting straight up in bed, heart pounding. The room was silent now. He grabbed the bedside lamp and took a walk through the house, checking every corner. Nothing. "You're getting old," he muttered to himself, shaking his head before going back to bed. But the sound returned the next night, and the night after that. By the third night, Brian had had enough. He grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, determined to find the source of the sound. As he stepped into the hallway, the air around him thickened, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. He reached the door to the upstairs bedroom, the one he never used. It was unlocked. Inside, the room smelled of dust and rotting wood. Nothing seemed out of place. But then he saw the mirror in the far corner. At first, he thought it was just his reflection shifting. But then, movement. A shape formed in the glass, something faint but growing clearer. It was a girl. She stood in the reflection, staring directly at him. She wore an old white dress, her long, tangled blonde hair falling over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow black voids. She tilted her head, as if studying him. Brian stumbled back, slamming the door shut. His hands shook as he braced against the wall, heart hammering. The next day, Brian visited the local bar and asked about the house. The bartender let out a slow breath and shook his head. "So, you've heard her?" Brian stayed silent. "That's Elizabeth. She died there." The bartender leaned in, voice low. "Her father wasn't right in the head. One night, he just disappeared. When folks went to check on the girl, they found her in that upstairs room." He hesitated. It wasn't a pretty sight. Brian felt a chill crawl up his spine. "They say she's still waiting," the bartender continued. "Waiting for him to come back." That night, Brian nailed the bedroom door shut. It didn't help. He heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. He felt her breath behind him as he shaved in the morning. And once, in the foggy mirror, he saw the imprint of a child's hand. But the worst came when he woke up in the middle of the night to an unnatural cold. At first, he thought he had left a window open. But when he looked down, his blood froze. A small, pale body lay beside him in bed. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. But he could feel her. A tiny, ice-cold hand brushed his wrist. Then she whispered, so close to his ear that he felt the words crawl under his skin, "Be my daddy." Brian screamed. And when he jumped out of bed, she was gone. He couldn't take it anymore. The next night, he grabbed his hammer, planks of wood, and a handful of rusted nails. He would seal that cursed room shut forever. As he drove the first nail into the doorframe, a whisper drifted through the air. "Don't." A chill spread through the house. The walls groaned, and the wind outside died completely. "Be my daddy." Brian turned around slowly. She stood there. This time, she wasn't just a ghostly shape in the mirror, she was solid, standing in the dim hallway, staring up at him. Her pale skin was nearly translucent, blue veins visible beneath the surface. In her eyes, black pits of nothingness, leaking thick red tears. "Be my daddy, or..." Something grabbed Brian's throat and threw him backward. He gasped for air, clawing at the invisible force crushing his windpipe. The walls around him pulsed, as if the house itself was breathing. He staggered toward the front door, but the floor beneath him cracked open. He fell. When he awoke, he was in darkness. His hands touched something damp and sticky. The ceiling above him was so low that he could barely move. Then realization struck. He was in a wooden box. Buried. She had buried him in the basement. Above him, faint scratching echoed. "Stay with me." Her voice slithered through the wood. Brian started pounding against the top of the coffin. His screams were muffled, eaten by the thick dirt pressing in around him. Then he heard movement. Something was in there with him. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, he saw it. Elizabeth was curled up beside him, her hollow black eyes locked onto his. Her tiny, ice-cold fingers slid across his cheek. "Now you're mine." The last thing Brian saw was the coffin lid slamming shut. Weeks later, local authorities investigated the house after neighbors reported an awful smell. They found nothing. But in the basement, they discovered an old wooden box. It was empty. Except for one thing. Carved into the inside of the lid, in deep, ragged scratches, was a single word: "Stay."